Staff entrances around back. The words landed flat and practiced, like a line repeated too many times to too many people. The revolving glass doors of Monroe Tower slowed behind her, Manhattan's late afternoon wind slipping in at 43 degrees and brushing against the marble lobby floor. Ava Monroe didn't move. She stood just inside the threshold of the building she had designed, financed, and named after her grandfather, while a young security associate in a navy blazer gestured politely but firmly toward the side exit. Executive floors require visible credentials, he added, eyes scanning her dark wool coat, her simple leather tote, the absence of a badge clipped to her lapel. Around them, the lobby hummed with the muted soundtrack of ambition, heels clicking against stone, elevator chimes, low conversations about quarterly targets and board approvals. Ava's reflection stared back at her from the polished chrome columns. Calm, measured, unimpressed. She had walked into rooms like this for 20 years and watched assumptions bloom before introductions were offered. She had learned that silence unsettled people more than outrage ever could. "I'm here for the board meeting," she said evenly. The front desk attendant, a white woman in her early 30s with a headset tucked behind one ear, typed quickly without making eye contact. "Name?" she asked. "Monroe." A pause. Another click of keys. A faint crease formed between the attendant's brows. "I don't see you on the guest list, ma'am. All board-level attendees checked in through private access this morning." Ava glanced toward the bank of elevators marked executive access only. Frosted glass. Gold lettering. The kind of details investors noticed during tours. "I don't need to be on the guest list," she replied. The attendant offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Everyone needs clearance." Behind Ava, the revolving doors spun again. Two men in tailored suits stepped inside, laughing about a merger rumored to close at $240 million. They flashed their badges without slowing down. The scanner beeped green. The elevator doors opened instantly. No questions. No hesitation. Ava watched the exchange without blinking. She had expected this. In fact, she had counted on it. Across the lobby, a junior operations assistant named Maya Collins froze mid-step when she heard the name. Monroe. She looked up from the tablet in her hand and studied the woman at the front desk more carefully. No entourage. No visible executive ID. Just a presence that felt anchored, as if the building itself recognized her. "Ma'am," the security associate said again, lowering his voice slightly. "If you're waiting for someone, we have seating outside. It's company policy." Outside. The word echoed differently than he intended. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just dismissive enough to sting. Ava turned her head slowly and met his eyes. There was no anger there. Only calculation. "Who approved that policy?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. He hesitated. "It's standard procedure." She nodded once. Standard. She had seen how that word protected bias for years. The attendant leaned closer to her screen. "If you can't provide executive credentials, I'll need you to step aside. We can't block access for verified guests." Block access. The phrasing was careful. Corporate. Sanitized. But the meaning was clear. You don't belong here. Ava felt the temperature shift, not in the lobby, but in memory. She was 23 again, standing in a venture capital office in Boston, portfolio in hand, while a receptionist asked if she was there to deliver catering. She remembered the heat in her cheeks. The way her voice trembled when she corrected them. She remembered promising herself she would never again beg to be recognized. The present snapped back into focus. The marble floor. The skyline visible through 20-foot windows. The company logo etched in steel. Monroe Global Holdings. Her grandfather's name. Her name. "Ma'am," the attendant pressed, impatience threading through her tone. Ava reached into her coat pocket, not for a badge, but for her phone. She didn't dial immediately. She let the silence stretch. Behind the desk, the attendant exchanged a quick glance with the security associate, as if confirming a shared conclusion. "We're going to need you to wait outside until HR verifies your identity," the attendant said finally, gesturing toward the glass doors. "Wait outside." Two simple words. In that moment, a regional manager named Thomas Whitaker stepped out of the executive corridor, alerted by the delay at the front desk. Mid-50s. Silver hair. Confident stride. He assessed the situation in under 3 seconds. Woman without visible credentials. Security uncertain. Front desk tense. He approached with the air of someone accustomed to restoring order. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked. The attendant answered quickly. "She claims she's here for the board meeting, but there's no clearance." Thomas gave Ava a polite but distant smile. "Board access is restricted, ma'am. If you're with catering or facilities, the service entrance is around back." The words were smooth, professional, and entirely wrong. Ava held his gaze. "I'm not with catering," she said. "Then I'll need you to step outside while we sort this out," he replied, the smile tightening. Around them, the lobby had slowed. Conversations softened. A few employees pretended not to watch while watching closely. Maya Collins felt her stomach drop. She had joined Monroe Global straight out of grad school. She had studied the founders' interviews, memorized the origin story of how a black woman from the south side of Chicago built a multi-state real estate empire valued at over $3.2 billion. She had seen the photos online, but in person, without the spotlight, without the title flashing beneath her name, Ava Monroe looked like any other woman in a winter coat. And that was the problem. "Sir," Maya ventured cautiously from across the lobby, "should we double-check ownership credentials in the internal system?" Thomas shot her a sharp look. "That won't be necessary." Ava noticed the exchange. She noticed everything. The hierarchy, the reflex to dismiss, the discomfort of being challenged. She finally lifted her phone and tapped a single contact. It rang once. "It's happening," she said quietly when the call connected. On the other end, her chief of staff responded without hesitation. "Understood. Protocol." Ava's eyes never left Thomas Whitaker. "Stand by." She ended the call. Thomas folded his hands in front of him, adopting a tone he likely used to de-escalate vendor disputes. "Ma'am, we have investors arriving. I can't allow unauthorized individuals in the executive corridor." Unauthorized. The word hovered like a verdict. Ava stepped forward half an inch, just enough to close the conversational distance. "You're asking me to wait outside my own building," she said softly. Thomas's smile flickered. "I'm asking you to follow procedure." Procedure. Another shield. The security associate shifted uncomfortably. The glass doors rotated again as more executives entered, flashing badges that unlocked access in seconds. Ava watched each green light, each unquestioned entry. She could feel the weight of 20 years pressing against this moment, not as anger, but as clarity. She had built Monroe Global to change how ownership looked in America. She had signed the original lease for this lot when the skyline was still dotted with cranes. She had negotiated every loan, overseen every blueprint, memorized every square foot of the 480,000 square foot tower rising 38 stories above Fifth Avenue. And now, she was being asked to wait outside. The irony would have been almost funny if it weren't so familiar. Maya took a cautious step closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, her name is Monroe." "It could be, that's enough," Thomas cut in. Ava raised one hand gently, not to silence Maya, but to steady the moment. She inhaled slowly, feeling the chill from the revolving doors brush past her again. 43 degrees outside. She imagined standing on the sidewalk while her own board discussed strategy on the 32nd floor. She imagined the headlines if she allowed this to continue unchecked. She imagined the employees watching, learning from this interaction what the company truly valued. Silence. She had been silent before. She had endured before. But not here. Not today. Her phone vibrated softly in her hand. A single notification. Internal system access ready. Ava lifted her eyes to Thomas one more time. "Before we continue," she said evenly, "you might want to check who owns 62% of Monroe Global Holdings." The lobby stilled, not because she raised her voice, but because something in her tone shifted, like a door unlocking somewhere far above them. And in that suspended breath between assumption and revelation, the building itself seemed to wait. Thomas Whitaker did not answer her immediately. For a fraction of a second, the practiced authority in his posture thinned, replaced by calculation. 62%. The number did not belong in casual conversation. It belonged in shareholder reports, in private equity briefings, in closed-door strategy sessions on the 32nd floor. Not in the lobby. Not spoken by a woman in a wool coat without a badge. The front desk attendant glanced at him, waiting for direction. The security associate shifted his weight, eyes moving from Ava to the company logo etched into the marble wall behind her, as if the letters themselves might confirm or deny her claim. Thomas cleared his throat. Ownership percentages are confidential information, he said evenly. If you are attempting to intimidate staff, that will not work. Ava tilted her head slightly. I am not attempting to intimidate anyone, she replied. I am attempting to understand why the majority owner of this company is being asked to stand on the sidewalk. The word majority landed differently than the number had. It did not shout. It settled. Across the lobby, Maya Collins felt her pulse quicken. She had memorized those figures during orientation. 62% controlling interest held by the founder. Ava Monroe had retained it deliberately, refusing dilution even when expansion demanded capital. It was one of the reasons analysts called her relentless. Maya looked at the internal operations tablet in her hand. There was a section rarely accessed by junior staff, a dashboard listing executive access privileges tied to ownership tiers. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Thomas's jaw tightened. Ma'am, he said, dropping the polished tone for something firmer. If you do not have visible credentials, I will have to ask you to exit the lobby until verification is complete. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The suggestion carried weight. Exit. Verification. The language of controlled spaces. Ava considered him carefully. She had hired Thomas Whitaker 6 years ago after a competitor tried to recruit him. His performance metrics had been strong. Revenue targets met. Turnover minimal. She remembered approving his compensation package herself. She wondered now what he had approved in her absence. Verification is already complete, she said quietly. At that exact moment, every badge scanner in the lobby emitted a soft tone. Not an alarm. Not an error. Just a synchronized digital chime that did not belong to routine traffic. Heads turned instinctively. The front desk monitor flickered once. The company logo minimized, replaced by a secure login interface requesting administrative authentication. The attendant blinked. What is happening? She whispered. Thomas frowned and stepped toward the screen. Probably a system update, he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Ava did not look at the monitors. She watched faces. Confusion. Unease. The first crack in certainty. Her phone vibrated again. She did not answer. She already knew what the message would say. Internal board protocol initiated. Ownership confirmation transmitted. Access hierarchy recalibrating. The building was recognizing her, even if her management team had not. Maya inhaled sharply as her own tablet refreshed automatically. The ownership dashboard unlocked without requiring a supervisor code. A single profile filled the screen. Founder and Chief Executive Officer. Ava Monroe. Controlling interest 62%. Lifetime executive clearance. Maya looked up slowly, her eyes finding Ava's face across the polished floor. Sir, she said carefully to Thomas, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The system has elevated her credentials. The front desk attendant stared at her monitor, color draining from her face as the executive access list repopulate with a name at the top. Monroe Ava. Status, active. Clearance, unrestricted. Thomas did not move for several seconds. The lobby felt suspended, as if the entire 38-story tower had paused to listen. Employees lingering near the elevators exchanged glances. A few pretended to check their phones while angling their screens toward the unfolding scene. Ava finally turned her gaze to the badge scanner beside the executive elevator. Would you like me to demonstrate visible credentials? She asked. Her tone remained measured. Controlled. There was no satisfaction in it. No gloating. Only clarity. Thomas exhaled slowly. If you are who the system indicates, he began, choosing each word with care, then there has been a misunderstanding. Ava met his eyes. There was no misunderstanding, she said. There was an assumption. The difference hung between them like a line drawn in ink. The security associate lowered his hand from the subtle blocking position he had maintained near the elevator entrance. The front desk attendant stepped back from her monitor, headset slipping slightly from behind her ear. I apologize, she said quickly, the words tumbling over each other. We were just following procedure. Procedure again. Ava nodded once. Procedure should protect people, she replied, not filter them. Thomas straightened his jacket, attempting to regain composure. Ms. Monroe, he said, finally allowing her title to surface. Had we been informed you would be entering through the main lobby, you would have treated me differently? Ava interrupted softly. The question was not sharp. It was worse. It was precise. He did not answer. Across the lobby, One of the executives who had entered earlier stepped out of the elevator bank, having heard fragments of the exchange. Recognition dawned on his face. "Ava," he said, startled. "We thought you were coming up through private access." She offered him a faint smile that did not reach her eyes. "I wanted to see the lobby," she replied. "I did." A faint ripple of discomfort passed through the small crowd. It was no longer a misunderstanding between a visitor and security. It was a leadership moment unfolding in real time. Maya took another cautious step forward. "Ms. Monroe," she said respectfully, "the board is assembling. They are waiting for you on 32. Ava nodded. "They will wait another minute." Her gaze returned to Thomas Whitaker. "How many guests have been asked to step outside while awaiting verification in the past 12 months? Thomas blinked. "I do not have that data available." "You should," she replied, "especially if the procedure is consistent." Silence again. Not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. Ava remembered being 16, standing in a department store in Chicago while a clerk followed her through every aisle without speaking. She remembered the way her mother had squeezed her hand and whispered, "You are not here to shrink. You are here to take up space." That lesson had followed her through every negotiation, every acquisition, every headline calling her an exception rather than the rule. Now, in her own lobby, she felt the echo of that whisper. "Do not shrink." "Effective immediately," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the marble floor. "I want a full audit of lobby access interactions for the past year. Demographic data. Escalation reports. Any documented removals." The front desk attendant's mouth parted slightly. Thomas's expression hardened, but there was no authority left in it. Only realization. "Ms. Monroe, perhaps this can be handled privately," he suggested. Ava shook her head gently. "Leadership is not private," she replied. "Culture is built in moments like this." The elevator chimes sounded again. A different tone this time. The executive elevator doors slid open without a badge scan, responding instead to the updated hierarchy in the system. The lobby lights seemed brighter somehow, though nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Ava stepped toward the elevator, then paused. She turned back once more to the staff at the desk. "No one should have to announce ownership to be treated with respect," she said. "Remember that." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. They settled into the air like a policy far older than any written manual. Thomas swallowed. "Understood," he managed. Ava held his gaze for one final second, then placed her palm lightly against the scanner. The panel glowed green instantly, not because of the gesture, but because the system already knew her. The doors parted wider, revealing the mirrored interior and the quiet hum of upward motion waiting to begin. She stepped inside without looking back. As the doors closed, the reflection of the lobby framed her in chrome and glass. Calm, anchored, unmoved. Outside the elevator, employees exhaled collectively, as if released from a tension they had not acknowledged until it lifted. Maya stared at the closed doors, heart racing, knowing she had just witnessed more than a verification. She had witnessed a correction. And 32 floors above, a boardroom full of executives was about to learn that the most important agenda item of the day had not been printed on any schedule. The executive elevator moved smoothly past the 10th floor, then the 20th, then the 30th, the city skyline sliding lower through the glass panels as Manhattan stretched outward in winter gray. Ava Monroe stood alone inside the mirrored cabin, hands relaxed at her sides, eyes steady on her reflection. There was no rush in her breathing, no visible frustration, only focus. The brief confrontation downstairs had not surprised her. It had confirmed something she had suspected for months. Culture did not fracture loudly. It shifted quietly, in lobbies and hallways, in the tone of a question, in the direction of a gesture. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 32nd floor. The doors opened to a corridor lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, the late afternoon light washing the space in pale gold. At the far end, the boardroom door stood open. Inside, 12 executives sat around a 20-foot walnut table, leather chairs angled toward a projection screen displaying quarterly performance metrics. Conversation slowed when she entered. Heads turned. A few stood immediately. Others followed half a second later, unsure of what they had missed but aware that something had shifted. "Ava," said Daniel Harper, Chief Financial Officer, his voice careful. "We were just reviewing the expansion numbers. She walked to the head of the table without haste. We will get to the numbers, she replied. But first, we are going to discuss the lobby. A subtle ripple moved through the room. Thomas Whitaker's name had not yet been spoken, but several board members had already received internal alerts about system escalations tied to ownership protocol. Ava placed her phone on the table, screen facing down. When I entered this building 10 minutes ago, she began, her tone even and unhurried. I was asked to wait outside because I did not appear to meet executive standards. Silence. Settled instantly. No one shuffled papers. No one reached for coffee. Daniel Harper cleared his throat. There must have been a miscommunication. Ava looked at him steadily. There was clarity, she said. The message was clear. I did not look like I belonged. Across the table, a senior board member shifted uncomfortably. Surely that was not the intention. Intention does not erase impact, Ava replied. And procedure does not excuse assumption. She tapped her phone once. The projection screen behind her flickered, replacing the financial charts with a dashboard of lobby access data. Timestamps. Incident reports. Escalation flags. The room leaned forward collectively. Over the past 12 months, she continued, there have been 27 documented cases of guests or employees being asked to provide additional verification beyond standard badge protocol. She paused deliberately. 19 of those individuals were people of color. The data hung in the air, undeniable and unemotional. Just numbers. But numbers carried weight in this room. Daniel's expression tightened. Are you suggesting discriminatory enforcement? Ava did not blink. I am stating measurable disparity. No one interrupted her. She walked slowly along the length of the table, not pacing, but occupying space. I built Monroe Global to redefine who owns commercial real estate in this country. I retained controlling interest because I believe culture must be directed from the top. Yet this morning, in my own lobby, ownership was invisible. The words were not raised. They did not need volume. They carried authority without it. A board member at the far end spoke cautiously. What are you proposing? Ava stopped walking. Immediate review of all front-facing management. Suspension pending investigation for any executive responsible for policy enforcement in lobby operations. A few exchanged glances. Thomas Whitaker was not in the room. He had remained downstairs, attempting to regain composure among staff who had just witnessed a recalibration of power. Daniel leaned forward. That is a significant move based on one incident. Ava met his gaze. It is not based on one incident, she said. It is based on a pattern that culminated in that incident. The screen shifted again, displaying anonymized complaint summaries from human resources files. Descriptions of guests feeling scrutinized. Employees reporting uneven treatment at entry checkpoints. Each entry dated. Each marked resolved without escalation. Resolved, Ava repeated quietly. Resolved without acknowledgement. The boardroom felt smaller now, the glass walls no longer expansive. But reflective. One member spoke up. Why were these not elevated previously? Ava's eyes remained steady. Because they were filtered through the same management tier responsible for enforcement. Understanding dawned slowly across several faces. This was not a spontaneous reaction. It was exposure. Ava folded her hands lightly on the back of a chair. Leadership is tested in ordinary moments, she said. Not in press conferences. Not in earnings calls. In lobbies. She let that settle. Then she continued. Effective immediately, Thomas Whitaker is relieved of operational authority pending review. A quiet intake of breath circled the table. Additionally, all lobby access procedures will be redesigned under direct oversight from my office. Daniel looked at her carefully. You are moving swiftly. Culture shifts quickly when left unattended, she replied. It must be corrected just as quickly. Outside the boardroom, the city moved as it always did. Traffic crawled along Fifth Avenue. Pedestrians hurried in coats against the winter air. Inside, a recalibration of corporate hierarchy was unfolding in real time. Ava straightened slightly. No one in this company should have to announce ownership to receive baseline respect, she said. That is not a branding issue. It is a values issue. A board member who had remained quiet until now spoke up. What would you like from us? Ava met each pair of eyes around the table before answering. Alignment, she said simply. And accountability. The word accountability did not echo loudly. It did not need to. It resonated through posture alone. Daniel nodded slowly. You have my support. One by one, others voiced agreement. Not because of optics, because the data left little room for denial. Ava pressed her phone once more. Downstairs, in the lobby, Thomas Whitaker's executive clearance shifted from unrestricted to administrative hold. His badge would still open standard office floors, but not strategic access points. Not until review. It was not theatrical. It was structural, the kind of shift that altered trajectory quietly. Ava returned to the head of the table. Now, she said, her tone transitioning seamlessly, let us review the expansion numbers. The projection screen returned to quarterly metrics as if nothing unusual had occurred. But everyone in that room knew something fundamental had changed. Not in the financial forecast. In the foundation. 40 floors below, employees were already whispering about what they had witnessed. About the calm in her voice. About the way. She did not shout. About the way the system itself seemed to respond to her presence. Maya Collins stood near the front desk, tablet in hand, replaying the moment in her mind when the ownership dashboard unlocked. She understood now that leadership was not volume. It was gravity, and gravity had just shifted the entire building without a single raised voice. Back upstairs, Ava reviewed profit margins with the same composure she had carried through the lobby. But beneath the financial analysis ran a deeper current. This was not the end of the correction. It was the beginning, because culture, once exposed, demanded restructuring. And Ava Monroe had never built anything halfway. The board meeting resumed on the surface, but the air had changed. Financial projections scrolled across the screen, expansion timelines were discussed, and acquisition targets were debated. Yet every executive in the room understood that the real restructuring had already begun. Ava Monroe listened without interruption, her posture composed, her focus unwavering. When Daniel Harper finished outlining the projected return on a $200 million mixed-use development in Dallas, she nodded once. The numbers are strong, she said evenly. But numbers are never the whole story. A subtle tension threaded through the room again. She was not finished. She never was. Ava tapped her phone once more, and the projection shifted from profit forecasts to an internal leadership map. Photographs of regional managers filled the screen. Names, tenure, performance ratings. Beneath Thomas Whitaker's name, the word pending review now replaced active oversight. It was not dramatic. It was precise. Leadership accountability does not stop at one position, Ava said calmly. If a culture gap exists in the lobby, it exists in reporting lines. A board member leaned forward. Are you proposing broader suspension? Ava shook her head slightly. I am proposing transparency. She walked slowly to the window overlooking Central Park, winter light reflecting off the snow dusting the trees below. For years, Monroe Global has marketed inclusion. We have placed it in annual reports, in recruitment materials, in investor briefings. But culture is not a paragraph in a report. It is a behavior repeated until it becomes normal. She turned back toward the table. What happened downstairs was normal. No one disagreed. Because the data she had shown made denial impossible. Daniel folded his hands together. What is the next step? He asked carefully. Ava's gaze sharpened, not with anger, but with resolve. Effective immediately, all executive leadership will undergo independent cultural competency audit. Not internal, not filtered. External review. A few eyebrows rose. External review meant outside scrutiny. It meant findings documented without internal editing. It meant exposure. That could impact investor perception, one board member offered cautiously. Ava did not hesitate. Investor confidence is not sustained by concealment, she replied. It is sustained by correction. Silence again. But this time it was agreement forming rather than resistance. Downstairs, the ripple had not settled. Thomas Whitaker stood near the front desk, staring at his badge as if it might explain what had just occurred. The front desk attendant avoided eye contact. The security associate kept his posture straight but distant. Maya Collins remained still, absorbing every detail. She had watched authority shift in less than 5 minutes. She had watched assumption collapse under quiet certainty. And she understood something deeply now. Power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it observed. Then it acted. Back upstairs, Ava resumed her seat at the head of the table. This company was founded on disruption, she said. Disruption of who owns property. Disruption of who sits at decision tables. But disruption without discipline becomes chaos. We will not allow that. Her tone never rose. It did not need to. It carried the steadiness of someone who had negotiated billion-dollar portfolios without once raising her voice. Daniel nodded slowly. The audit will begin immediately, he confirmed. I will notify compliance. Ava inclined her head once in acknowledgement. Additionally, she continued, all lobby staff will be retrained under revised access protocol. No discretionary verification beyond badge policy unless triggered by documented security alert. She paused briefly, letting the language register. Procedure will protect people, not filter them. The phrase settled across the table like a line carved in stone. A senior board member spoke quietly. You could have handled this privately. Ava met his eyes. Privacy protects comfort, she said. Visibility protects integrity. No one challenged that. Because they had all seen the data. They had all seen the system recalibrate the moment ownership was asserted. And they understood that the recalibration would not be reversed. Ava leaned back slightly, hands resting calmly against the armrests of her chair. The expansion numbers remained strong, she added, returning to business with seamless composure. But expansion without internal alignment creates instability. The conversation shifted again to financial forecasts, but it moved differently now. More measured, more aware. Because everyone present understood that leadership was not a title granted by vote. It was authority demonstrated under pressure. 40 minutes later, the board meeting adjourned. Executives gathered their materials quietly, offering brief nods as they exited. Some avoided her gaze out of reflection. Others met it with renewed respect. Ava remained seated until the room emptied. When the door closed behind the last member, she allowed herself one slow exhale. Not of relief, of clarity. She stood and walked back toward the window. 32 floors below, the lobby looked small from this height. People moved like quiet figures on a chessboard. She thought briefly of her mother's voice again. You are not here to shrink. You are here to take up space. Ava reached for her phone and dialed her chief of staff. Initiate executive notification, she said calmly when the call connected. Thomas Whitaker is relieved of operational authority effective immediately. Interim oversight will report directly to me. There was no drama in the statement. Just structure. Understood, came the reply. Communication will be sent within 5 minutes. Ava ended the call and glanced once more at the skyline. She had built this tower from the ground up. She had signed the first contract when banks hesitated. She had held majority interest when advisors urged dilution. She had retained control because she knew that culture could not be delegated indefinitely. Downstairs, an internal message appeared on Thomas Whitaker's company device. Administrative authority suspended pending review. He read it twice, the words blurring slightly. Around him, employees pretended not to notice, but noticed everything. The front desk attendant swallowed and straightened her posture. The security associate adjusted his tie. Maya Collins felt something settle inside her chest. Not fear, not triumph. Something steadier. Accountability had a sound. It was quiet. Upstairs, Ava stepped out of the boardroom and into the corridor. The winter light had softened further, casting long shadows along the polished floor. As she walked toward the elevator, several employees paused respectfully. She acknowledged each with a nod, not as a monarch surveying subjects, as a leader reclaiming alignment. The elevator doors opened without hesitation. She stepped inside alone once more. As the cabin descended floor by floor, she watched her reflection again. Calm, unshaken. The events of the morning had not required shouting. They had required clarity. The doors opened to the lobby. Conversations hushed instinctively. Ava stepped out and walked directly toward the front desk. Thomas Whitaker turned as she approached, posture rigid but subdued. She did not raise her voice. She did not glare. She simply stood in front of him and said, "Your authority has been suspended pending review." The statement was factual, final. The front desk attendant stared at the marble counter. The security associate kept his gaze forward. Maya watched from several feet away, memorizing the moment. Thomas swallowed, attempting composure. Understood, he replied quietly. Ava held his gaze for a brief second longer. Leadership is not about who you recognize, she said evenly. It is about who you respect when you do not. She turned and walked toward the glass doors, pausing briefly to look back at the lobby. Not with anger, not with resentment, with assessment. Then she exited into the winter air for the first time that day by choice, not by dismissal. The cold touched her face as she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the 38-story tower bearing her name. She had been asked to wait outside. Instead, she had restructured the inside. And the building, from foundation to executive floor, would not forget it. The winter air carried a sharp edge as Ava Monroe stood on the sidewalk across from the glass facade of Monroe Tower, hands tucked lightly into the pockets of her wool coat. Yellow taxis moved in steady rhythm along Fifth Avenue, horns muted beneath the steady hum of the city. Pedestrians hurried past without recognizing her, some glancing briefly at the towering name etched above the entrance before continuing on. She had stepped outside by choice this time, not because she had been dismissed, not because someone had decided she did not belong. She had walked out on her own terms. The difference mattered. Behind the glass, the lobby moved differently now. Conversations were quieter, movements more measured. Authority had shifted in less than an hour, and everyone inside could feel it. Ava lifted her gaze slowly up the 38 stories of steel and glass, remembering the first day construction began. There had been skepticism then too. Banks questioning her projections. Contractors doubting her financing strategy. Advisors suggesting she dilute her ownership to reduce risk. She had listened. Then she had built anyway. Retained 62%. Retained control. Because she understood something fundamental. Culture followed control. And control had to be intentional. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from compliance confirmed executive suspension had been logged in the internal system. Another notification from communications confirmed a leadership review announcement would be delivered to all employees within the hour. Ava read both messages without expression and slid her phone back into her pocket. The work was not finished. It had just begun. Inside the lobby, Thomas Whitaker stood near the front desk, posture straight, but hollowed of its former certainty. His device displayed restricted access notifications he had never expected to see. He glanced once toward the glass doors, catching a glimpse of Ava across the street. She was not pacing. She was not angry. She was simply observing. That unsettled him more than confrontation would have. The front desk attendant adjusted her headset again, avoiding eye contact with both Thomas and the security associate. The rhythm of the lobby felt recalibrated. The unspoken hierarchy that had once favored assumption now felt unstable. Maya Collins remained a few feet away, tablet in hand, her thoughts racing. She had entered the building that morning focused on quarterly deliverables and presentation deadlines. Instead, she had witnessed a masterclass in controlled authority. No raised voice. No spectacle. Just precision. She replayed the moment when the system recognized Ava before management did. The data had not flinched. It had responded instantly. Ownership confirmed. Clearance unrestricted. It had not cared about attire. It had not paused at appearance. It had simply followed fact. Maya understood something deeply in that instant. Systems can be programmed for neutrality. People must choose it. Across the street, Ava crossed back toward the building, heels steady against the concrete, coat moving slightly with each step. The revolving doors parted as she approached. No one blocked her now. The security associate stepped aside without being instructed. The front desk attendant straightened visibly. Thomas turned fully as she entered. Ava walked directly to the center of the lobby and stopped, allowing her presence to settle the room. All leadership staff will report to the conference center at 3 o'clock, she said calmly. Her voice carried without strain. Attendance is mandatory. No one questioned the directive. Thomas opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. There was nothing to argue. Authority had been clarified. Ava's eyes moved across the lobby, taking in each employee present. She saw uncertainty. She saw embarrassment. She saw reflection. She also saw opportunity. Respect is not a privilege reserved for titles, she continued evenly. It is a baseline expectation. The words were not delivered as a reprimand. They were delivered as policy. She turned slightly toward Thomas. You will prepare a complete report of all lobby escalations within the past 12 months and deliver it to compliance before noon tomorrow. His response came quietly. Yes. No defense. No resistance. Just acknowledgement. Ava nodded once and walked toward the elevators again. This time, she did not glance at the scanner. The doors opened automatically, responding to the recalibrated system that now mirrored her authority without friction. As she ascended, the hum of the elevator felt steadier than before. 32 floors above, the boardroom lights remained on, though the meeting had ended. Her chief of staff waited inside, laptop open, already reviewing preliminary audit timelines. When Ava entered, she closed the door behind her gently. Communications has drafted the announcement, her chief of staff said. Do you want to review it before distribution? Ava removed her coat and placed it neatly over the back of a chair. Read it to me, she replied. The message was concise. Leadership restructuring, cultural audit, commitment to equitable enforcement of policy. Ava listened without interruption. When it finished, she shook her head slightly. Add this sentence, she said calmly. No one should have to identify ownership to be treated with dignity within these walls. Her chief of staff nodded and typed immediately. Ava moved to the window once more, watching as the winter sun dipped lower across the skyline. Her mind drifted briefly, not to the lobby, but further back. She remembered being 12 years old, standing beside her grandfather outside a small storefront he owned in Chicago. A tenant had questioned whether he truly owned the building. Her grandfather had smiled and handed over the deed without raising his voice. Later, he told her, never argue your value. Demonstrate it. That lesson had anchored her for decades. Today had been another demonstration. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Daniel Harper. Full board alignment confirmed. Audit approved unanimously. She allowed herself the faintest exhale. Alignment mattered. Not for ego. For execution. Downstairs, employees were already reading the internal announcement. Screens lit up with the subject line. Leadership Accountability Initiative. Murmurs moved quietly through departments. Some felt anxious. Others felt relieved. Many felt both. Maya stood near the elevator bank, rereading the sentence Ava had added. No one should have to identify ownership to be treated with dignity. It resonated beyond the lobby, beyond the building. It felt personal. Back in the boardroom, Ava turned away from the window and faced her chief of staff. Schedule a town hall for tomorrow morning, she said. Open questions. No pre-screening. Her chief of staff paused briefly. That will invite difficult conversations. Ava met her eyes steadily. Difficult conversations prevent repeated mistakes. The response was simple. Absolute. The building hummed quietly around them as the sun slipped below the horizon. Lights flickered on across Manhattan. Monroe Tower reflected the city's glow back onto itself, glass catching amber and gold. Ava glanced once more at the skyline. She had been asked to wait outside. Instead, she had stepped fully inside and redefined the room. Not with noise, with structure. The correction had not required spectacle. It had required ownership. And ownership, when exercised with clarity, did not ask permission. It adjusted the system so the next person would not have to. The next morning, Monroe Tower felt different before the doors even opened. Employees arrived earlier than usual, some clutching coffee cups more tightly than normal, others checking their phones in the revolving doors as if expecting another internal notification. The Leadership Accountability Initiative email had circulated overnight. It had been forwarded, screenshot, discussed in group texts, and quietly dissected at kitchen tables across Manhattan. By 8:30, the lobby carried a tension that was not fear, but anticipation. At precisely 9 o'clock, the conference center on the 5th floor filled beyond capacity. Folding chairs were added along the back wall. Some employees stood along the perimeter, tablets in hand, ready to take notes. A live internal stream connected regional offices in Chicago, Dallas, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. Faces appeared on the large wall screens, each office mirrored in rows of attentive silence. Ava Monroe stepped onto the low platform at the front of the room without introduction. She wore a charcoal suit that morning, tailored but simple, no visible jewelry beyond a slim watch. She did not carry a script. She did not need one. The room quieted immediately, not because she demanded silence, but because presence alone commanded it. She stood for a moment, scanning the crowd. She recognized faces from finance, operations, marketing, property management. She saw Maya Collins near the third row, posture upright, eyes steady. She saw Thomas Whitaker seated along the side wall, no longer at the front, his executive badge still clipped to his jacket, but inactive beyond standard access. Ava allowed the silence to settle fully before she spoke. Yesterday, she began evenly. I entered this building and was asked to wait outside. The room did not shift. No one whispered. The statement did not require elaboration. It was already understood. Not because of a security alert, she continued. Not because of a documented concern. Because I did not match an expectation. Her voice did not harden. It clarified. This is not about my title. It is about our standard. A faint movement rippled across the back row. In Chicago, a regional manager straightened visibly on the live stream. Ava took one slow step forward. Culture is not what we publish, she said. It is what we practice when no one is watching. She paused briefly, then added, and yesterday, everyone was watching. The statement landed gently but firmly. She did not accuse. She did not dramatize. She stated fact. Our internal data shows disparity in access enforcement, she continued. 19 of 27 escalations over the past 12 months involved people of color. That is not coincidence. That is pattern. The word pattern held weight. It was clinical, undeniable. Thomas Whitaker shifted slightly in his seat, but did not look away. Ava's eyes swept the room again. Leadership will undergo independent review, she said calmly. Lobby procedures are being redesigned. Discretionary verification will require documented cause. No assumptions. She let the last word stand alone. No assumptions. A hand rose hesitantly from the fourth row. Ava nodded toward the employee. If someone feels uncertain in a situation, the employee asked carefully, how do we balance safety with fairness? Ava's expression remained steady. Safety is not compromised by neutrality, she replied. Verification triggered by behavior is different than verification triggered by bias. She stepped closer to the edge of the platform. We will train for that distinction. Thoroughly. Another hand lifted, this time from a property manager joining remotely from Dallas. Will disciplinary action extend beyond suspension? Ava did not hesitate. Accountability extends as far as evidence requires, she answered evenly. Position does not shield responsibility. The room absorbed that quietly. She was not threatening. She was clarifying hierarchy. A third voice spoke from the back. Why address this publicly? Ava met the question directly. Because privacy protects comfort, she said, repeating the phrase she had spoken in the boardroom. Visibility protects integrity. A subtle murmur of agreement passed through the audience. Maya felt her chest steady. The words resonated deeper than corporate language. They felt structural. Ava allowed one more pause before continuing. No one in this company should need to identify ownership, status, or wealth to receive baseline respect, she said clearly. Dignity is not tiered. The sentence echoed lightly against the conference center walls. She glanced briefly toward Thomas. Not with accusation. With acknowledgement. We will correct this, she said simply. Together. Then she stepped back slightly and opened the floor fully. Questions followed. Some were cautious. Some were direct. None were ignored. Ava answered each with the same measured tone, never defensive, never dismissive. She did not minimize concern. She did not dramatize error. She clarified standard. After 45 minutes, the session concluded not with applause, but with a quiet sense of recalibration. Employees rose slowly, conversations starting in low tones as they exited. Some approached her briefly to express appreciation. Others simply nodded respectfully. Maya remained seated for a moment longer, absorbing the weight of what she had witnessed. Authority without volume. Correction without humiliation. She understood now that leadership was not about proving power. It was about applying it precisely. Thomas lingered near the exit, uncertain whether to approach. Ava noticed him before he moved. She stepped down from the platform and walked toward him without hesitation. The space around them thinned instinctively as nearby employees drifted away. Thomas met her gaze, his composure restored but tempered. I accept responsibility, he said quietly. Ava studied him for a long second. Responsibility is the beginning, she replied. Reflection determines whether it becomes growth. He nodded once. I understand. She did not extend further commentary. She did not need to. Structural change was already in motion. As the conference center emptied, Ava walked back toward the elevator bank. Employees parted respectfully, not out of fear, but acknowledgement. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside alone once more. The descent was smooth, controlled. When the doors parted onto the lobby, the atmosphere felt lighter than it had 24 hours earlier. Not because tension had vanished, because direction had been clarified. The front desk attendant stood straighter, greeting each entrant with visible attentiveness. The security associate nodded respectfully as Ava passed. She paused briefly at the center of the marble floor, looking around at the polished chrome columns, the etched company logo, the sunlight filtering through the glass. The space felt aligned differently now. Not perfect, but corrected. Her phone vibrated again. A notification confirmed the external audit firm had accepted the review contract effective immediately. Ava allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible nod. The work was ongoing. Culture was not rewritten in a single morning. But foundation had shifted, and foundation determined structure. She turned toward the exit once more, not to leave in dismissal, but to walk through the doors on her own terms again. Outside, the winter air carried the same sharp edge as the day before, but the building behind her stood differently. It no longer felt like a space where assumption moved unchecked. It felt like a system recalibrating under deliberate ownership. Ava Monroe had not needed to raise her voice. She had raised the standard instead, and standards, once elevated, did not lower easily. By late afternoon the following day, Monroe Tower no longer felt like a building reacting to an incident. It felt like a system under reconstruction. Consultants from the independent audit firm moved through the lobby with tablets and quiet focus, observing interactions without interference. Employees were aware of their presence, but the atmosphere was not defensive. It was deliberate. Ava Monroe stood on the mezzanine level overlooking the marble floor below, hands resting lightly on the glass railing. She was not there to supervise optics. She was there to observe patterns. From that vantage point, she could see everything. The spacing between the front desk and the security podium. The subtle pause when certain guests approached. The difference in tone when greeting changed from automatic to evaluative. Culture revealed itself in seconds if one knew how to look. Her chief of staff joined her quietly. The external team has requested access to prior human resources interviews, she said. Ava nodded once. Granted. Full transparency. There was no hesitation in her response. Across the lobby, Maya Collins was speaking with one of the auditors, recounting what she had witnessed when the system elevated ownership clearance. She did not embellish. She described the sequence precisely. Name entered. Credentials unlocked. Executive access confirmed. Her voice remained steady, but beneath it lay something resolute. She understood that her testimony was not about one moment. It was about precedent. On the far side of the lobby, Thomas Whitaker stood near a column, no longer directing traffic, no longer issuing quiet instructions. His posture was professional, but the weight of administrative suspension lingered around him. He had submitted the requested report that morning. 27 escalations. 19 involving people of color. Each marked resolved. Each closed without external review. Numbers that had once felt procedural now read differently. Ava watched as a visitor entered through the revolving doors, pausing briefly at the threshold. The front desk attendant greeted him immediately, tone neutral, no hesitation. Badge scanned. Green light. The interaction lasted less than 3 seconds. Ava studied the cadence. No additional verification. No extra question. Just policy applied evenly. It was a small correction, but small corrections prevented systemic drift. Her phone vibrated with a message from Daniel Harper. Preliminary investor inquiries have begun. Press is not yet engaged. She typed a short response. We will address externally when the audit concludes. No reactive statements. Precision mattered. Public narrative could distort if rushed. She would not allow that. The mezzanine lights reflected faintly against the polished marble below. Ava remained still for another minute before descending the staircase back to the lobby floor. Conversations softened as she approached, not from fear, but from attentiveness. She walked toward the front desk deliberately, stopping beside the attendant who had once asked her to step outside. The young woman straightened visibly. How are you feeling today? Ava asked calmly. The question was not rhetorical. The attendant blinked, surprised by the simplicity of it. Focused, she replied quietly. Ava nodded. Good. Focus on consistency, not perception. The attendant swallowed and nodded in return. There was no reprimand in Ava's tone, only expectation. A few feet away, the security associate stood at attention. Ava turned toward him next. What did you learn from yesterday? She asked evenly. He hesitated briefly, then answered with honesty. That assumption moves faster than verification, he said. Ava held his gaze. And, she prompted gently. And that I must slow it down, he finished. She inclined her head once. Correct. No further lecture. No extended dialogue. Correction acknowledged. Standard reinforced. Thomas stepped forward then, closing the distance between them carefully. I have completed the report, he said. There were instances I did not fully review at the time. Ava studied him for a long moment. Why? She asked. The question was not accusatory. It was investigative. Thomas exhaled slowly. Volume, he said. Operational pressure. I relied on supervisors to filter. Ava's expression remained neutral. Delegation does not remove responsibility, she replied. He nodded once. I understand. Silence lingered between them for a brief second, heavy but not hostile. Then Ava spoke again. Reflection will determine whether you remain part of this structure. It was neither a promise nor a threat. It was conditional truth. Thomas did not argue. He simply acknowledged it. The auditors continued moving quietly through the space, documenting tone, sequence, response times. Culture could be measured. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. Ava walked toward the revolving doors and stepped outside once more, pausing on the sidewalk as evening traffic thickened. The city lights had begun to glow again, mirroring the previous night, but with altered awareness. She looked up at the tower bearing her name and considered the arc of 48 hours. From dismissal to recalibration, from assumption to audit. It had not required spectacle. It had required ownership. Her mind drifted briefly to her grandfather again, handing over the deed of his small storefront decades earlier without raising his voice. Never argue your value. Demonstrate it. She had demonstrated it in the most corporate way possible. Through structure. Through policy. Through measurable consequence. Her phone vibrated again. A message from the external firm confirmed preliminary findings would be ready within 72 hours. Ava typed a single response. Thank you. Then she slipped the device back into her pocket and stood quietly for another moment in the winter air. She had been asked to wait outside less than 2 days earlier. Now she stood outside by choice, knowing the inside was adjusting. The revolving doors turned behind her as employees exited for the evening, some glancing at her with renewed understanding. Not of her wealth, not of her title, of her standard. Ava finally turned and re-entered the lobby one last time before leaving for the night. The marble floor reflected the ceiling lights evenly. The company logo gleamed against the far wall. The front desk. Attendant greeted a late-arriving executive without pause, tone neutral, respectful, consistent. Badge scanned. Green light. No hesitation. Ava watched the interaction from a distance. 3 seconds. No assumption. Just protocol. She allowed herself the smallest nod. Correction was not complete. It never would be entirely. But foundation had shifted. And foundation determined trajectory. She walked toward the elevator bank, the doors opening smoothly at her approach, system recognizing her presence without friction. As the cabin ascended, she caught her reflection once more in the mirrored wall. Calm. Unshaken. Unapologetic. Leadership did not require volume. It required alignment. And alignment, once enforced, resonated through steel and glass alike. When the doors closed behind her, the lobby remained steady. Not silent. Not tense. Simply recalibrated. Monroe Tower had not changed its height. It had changed its standard. And standards, when raised deliberately, did not descend easily. 72 hours later, the preliminary audit findings arrived just before sunrise. Ava Monroe was already awake when the encrypted report landed in her inbox. Manhattan was still dim, the city stretching quietly beneath a pale winter sky. She sat alone at the long walnut table in her private office on the 38th floor, a cup of black coffee cooling untouched beside her laptop. The tower was silent at this hour, long before employees would begin filtering through the revolving doors downstairs. She preferred it that way. Silence revealed clarity. She opened the report without hesitation. No brace. No dread. Just readiness. The findings were direct. Documented disparities in discretionary verification. Inconsistent application of lobby protocol across demographic lines. Escalation reports closed without secondary review. No explicit discriminatory language. No overt hostility. Just patterns. Patterns built from small decisions repeated quietly. Ava read every page without interruption. Her expression did not shift. The data confirmed what she already knew. Bias did not need to shout. It accumulated. At 6:30, the skyline began to glow faintly pink beyond the glass walls of her office. She closed the report and stood, walking toward the window. 38 floors below, the marble lobby looked almost unreal in its stillness, polished and empty, waiting for movement. She rested one hand lightly against the glass. She remembered another morning decades earlier, standing in a different building entirely. She had been 25, freshly graduated, portfolio under her arm, waiting in the lobby of a real estate investment firm. In Boston, the receptionist had looked at her resume, then at her, then back at the paper. "Are you here for the administrative assistant role?" she had asked politely. Ava had smiled evenly and replied, "No. I am here to pitch a development proposal." The receptionist had blinked, surprised but not apologetic. That morning, Ava had delivered her pitch anyway. They had declined funding. She had built without them. The memory did not carry bitterness. It carried instruction. Systems reflect who designs them. If the design is flawed, correction must be structural. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Her chief of staff entered quietly. "The audit summary is prepared for distribution," she said. Ava turned from the window. "Schedule a leadership briefing at 9, she replied calmly. Full transparency. By 8:30, the executive conference center filled again. This time, the atmosphere was heavier. Not anxious. Weightier. The audit findings were projected on the main screen, page by page. Ava stood at the front of the room, posture straight, hands relaxed at her sides. "The review confirms disparity in discretionary verification," she began evenly. "Not through declared policy. Through applied behavior." No one shifted in their seats. The clarity left no room for distraction. "Intent is not the metric," she continued. "Impact is." She let the words settle before advancing the slide. Graphs displayed ratios. Charts illustrated trend lines. Names were not highlighted publicly. This was not spectacle. It was correction. Thomas Whitaker sat along the side wall, eyes fixed forward. He had read the summary that morning. He knew what it contained. Ava's gaze moved across the room briefly, acknowledging him without isolating him. "This is not a condemnation of individuals," she said. "It is a recalibration of standards." She paused. "But standards require accountability." The final slide displayed 3 directives. Mandatory cultural competency certification for all management. Removal of discretionary verification authority from mid-level supervisors. Establishment of an independent oversight committee reporting directly to the chief executive officer. The room absorbed the directives quietly. A board member spoke first. "Will this be communicated externally?" Ava nodded once. "Yes. After internal alignment is complete." She stepped forward slightly. "We do not hide correction. We demonstrate it." Her voice remained steady, unraised, unshaken. Another executive asked cautiously, "And leadership changes?" Ava held the question for a moment. "Leadership will be evaluated based on compliance and reflection," she answered. "Position does not supersede principle." The phrase resonated clearly. Thomas lowered his gaze briefly, not in humiliation, but in recognition. The briefing concluded without applause. There was no need for it. Decisions had been made. Structure had shifted. As executives exited the room, conversations were subdued but focused. No defensiveness. No denial. Only adjustment. Ava remained for a moment after the room emptied, looking at the screen where the final directive still glowed faintly. Oversight Committee reporting directly to the Chief Executive Officer. Ownership had expanded beyond equity. It now extended into culture with equal precision. Downstairs, employees began arriving for the workday. The front desk attendant greeted each entrant evenly. The security associate scanned badges without hesitation or extra scrutiny. 3 seconds per interaction. Consistent. Observable. The auditors remained present, documenting compliance. Maya Collins watched each exchange with new awareness. She no longer saw a lobby. She saw a system in transition. Around 10 o'clock, Ava descended from her office to the lobby floor once more. The elevator doors opened smoothly. She stepped out and walked toward the center of the marble space. Conversations softened instinctively, but not out of fear, out of attention. She turned slowly, taking in the polished columns, the etched company logo, the steady rhythm of badge scanners lighting green. She addressed the employees within earshot calmly. "The audit findings confirm what we witnessed," she said. "Correction is now policy." No dramatic pause. No grand gesture. Just clarity. She glanced briefly toward Thomas, who stood near the column where he had once directed traffic. Leadership is not about authority over space, she said evenly. It is about responsibility within it. The sentence landed gently but firmly. Thomas nodded once, accepting its weight. Ava turned toward the revolving doors again. For a moment, she stood just inside the threshold, remembering the first day she had walked through them as founder, long before the building had her name engraved above it. Back then, she had been questioned by lenders, doubted by contractors, underestimated by peers. She had not raised her voice then either. She had raised her standard. She stepped outside into the crisp morning air once more, looking up at the 38 stories of steel and glass. The winter sun reflected brightly off the facade now, sharper than before. The tower stood unchanged in height, but different in alignment. She knew culture would require continuous vigilance. Bias did not vanish overnight, but foundation had shifted. Oversight had been formalized. Discretion had been narrowed. The next person who walked through those revolving doors without a visible badge would not be measured against assumption. They would be measured against policy. Ava allowed herself a slow breath, then turned and re-entered the building. Not as someone seeking entry. Not as someone demanding recognition. As someone who had restructured the room without shouting in it. The lobby hummed steadily around her, badge scanners glowing green in quiet rhythm. Ownership did not need to announce itself anymore. It had embedded itself in the system. And systems, once corrected at the root, do not forget easily. The Oversight Committee convened 3 days after the audit briefing, not in the executive boardroom, but in a smaller glass conference suite overlooking the lobby itself. Ava Monroe had chosen the location deliberately. Culture reform should remain visible to the space it intended to correct. Through the clear panels behind her, the marble floor could be seen below, badge scanners glowing green in steady rhythm, employees moving with measured consistency. The room filled gradually with selected members from operations, compliance, human resources, and 2 rotating representatives from entry-level staff. Maya Collins had been invited to sit in as one of those representatives. She entered quietly, taking her seat with a mix of composure and awareness. She understood the significance. Her presence signaled structural inclusion, not symbolic participation. Ava stood at the head of the oval table without notes in her hands. Oversight is not temporary, she began evenly. It is embedded. Her tone carried the same calm precision it always did. We are not responding to a single incident. We are recalibrating a pattern. A compliance officer nodded and activated the wall display. Updated access metrics filled the screen. 3 days of post-audit data already showed improvement. No discretionary escalations. No demographic imbalance in verification. Response times consistent across all entries. Ava studied the numbers briefly, then shifted her gaze to the room. Sustainability is the objective, she said. Correction without monitoring reverts. She let the sentence settle. It was not dramatic. It was factual. One of the operations directors cleared his throat. We have already received positive internal feedback, he offered. Staff feel clearer on expectations. Ava inclined her head slightly. Clarity reduces bias, she replied. Ambiguity invites it. Maya watched closely, absorbing not just the content but the cadence. Ava did not rush. She did not lecture. She layered principle over procedure. Another committee member spoke cautiously. Thomas Whitaker has requested the opportunity to address the committee. The room shifted slightly at the mention of his name. Ava's expression did not change. He may speak, she said calmly. Moments later, Thomas entered the conference suite, posture straight but subdued. He did not take a seat at the head of the table. He chose one along the side. He glanced once through the glass toward the lobby below before facing Ava directly. I have reviewed the findings, he began, voice steady though lower than before. I recognize the gap between policy and practice under my supervision. No defensiveness. No justification. Ava watched him carefully. What have you learned? She asked evenly. Thomas paused before answering. That delegation without verification becomes negligence, he said. That I trusted filtering mechanisms instead of validating them. Ava nodded once. And going forward? She prompted. If permitted to remain in leadership, he replied carefully, I would implement structured cross-review. No escalation closed without second-level evaluation. No discretionary verification without written cause. The room absorbed his response quietly. Ava's gaze remained steady. Leadership is not measured by perfection, she said. It is measured by correction. She let that sentence settle before continuing. Your future within this structure will depend on sustained adherence to these standards. It was neither dismissal nor reinstatement. It was conditional alignment. Thomas inclined his head once. Understood. The committee proceeded with structural refinements. Lobby protocol was codified into written directive, eliminating ambiguous language that allowed interpretation. A real-time escalation dashboard would be visible not only to supervisors, but to compliance officers and the Oversight Committee. Quarterly audits would become standard practice rather than reactionary response. Maya listened closely, realizing the shift was no longer symbolic. It was architectural. Systems were being redesigned at the root. After an hour of discussion, the committee session concluded with assignments distributed clearly. Ava remained seated briefly as others gathered their materials. Maya lingered slightly, then approached carefully. "Thank you for including staff representation," she said softly. Ava met her eyes with calm acknowledgement. "Perspective strengthens structure," she replied. "Silence weakens it." The phrase lingered in Maya's mind as she exited the room. Downstairs, the lobby continued its steady rhythm. The front desk attendant greeted each entrant evenly. The security associate maintained posture without presumption. 3 seconds per interaction. Badge. Green light. Entry. Ava descended from the conference suite to the mezzanine once more, watching quietly from above. She was not seeking error. She was observing alignment. The memory of that first afternoon remained present, but it no longer carried tension. It carried instruction. She remembered standing on the sidewalk in the winter cold, asked to wait outside a building she owned. The chill had not been physical alone. It had been symbolic. Exclusion masked as procedure. Now, the same doors rotated with neutral rhythm. No one paused unnecessarily at the threshold. No one was filtered through perception. Procedure had been refined to protect rather than question. Her phone vibrated softly with a message from Daniel Harper. Investor inquiries have stabilized. Positive response to transparency. Ava allowed a faint nod. Correction rarely harmed reputation when executed with clarity. She stepped down from the mezzanine and walked across the marble floor slowly. Employees acknowledged her presence with composed respect, not deference. Alignment. She stopped briefly at the front desk again, observing a visitor scanning his badge. Green light. No hesitation. She glanced toward the attendant. Consistency? She asked quietly. Yes. The attendant replied with confidence. Ava nodded once. Maintain it. She moved toward the revolving doors, pausing just inside the threshold once more. The winter air beyond the glass had softened slightly as the week progressed, the temperature rising to 48 degrees. She stepped outside again, not in dismissal but in reflection. The tower behind her gleamed in afternoon light. The name etched above the entrance reflected clearly against the sky. She had not needed to shout to be heard. She had needed to align structure with principle. Her grandfather's words echoed once more in memory. Never argue your value. Demonstrate it. She had demonstrated it not by demanding apology, but by redesigning policy. The lobby would not remember her voice raised. It would remember her standard raised. She turned and re-entered the building again, the revolving doors parting smoothly. Inside, the marble floor reflected overhead lights in steady symmetry. The badge scanners continued their quiet rhythm. Green, green, green. Ownership no longer required announcement. It had been embedded into the architecture of accountability. And accountability, once formalized, did not depend on memory. It depended on structure. Ava walked toward the elevator bank once more, the doors opening in seamless response. As the cabin ascended, she saw her reflection again in the mirrored panel. Calm, precise, unmoved. The incident that began with a simple instruction to wait outside had evolved into systemic reform. Not through outrage, through ownership. And ownership, when exercised deliberately, reshaped rooms without ever raising its voice. 2 weeks after the Oversight Committee formalized its directives, Monroe Tower no longer felt like a building correcting itself. It felt like a building redefined. The marble lobby carried the same polished shine, the same soft echo of heels and elevator chimes, but the tension that once lived in subtle pauses had dissolved into rhythm. 3 seconds per interaction. Badge. Green light. Entry. Consistent. Observable. Repeatable. Ava Monroe stood once again on the mezzanine level overlooking the floor below, not as a watchdog, not as a symbol, but as an architect evaluating structure. The external audit firm had delivered its final report that morning. Compliance metrics were aligned. Escalation disparities eliminated. Written procedures clarified and distributed company-wide. Investor response remained steady. Media had begun to inquire, but the narrative was not scandal. It was reform. Transparency had insulated perception. Her chief of staff approached quietly with a tablet in hand. "The final report is ready for internal publication," she said. Ava nodded once. "Release it in full," she replied calmly. "No summary. No edits." The decision was deliberate. Transparency was not partial. It was structural. Below, employees moved through the lobby with measured confidence. The front desk attendant greeted each arrival without hesitation. The security associate scanned badges without additional scrutiny. Thomas Whitaker now stood several steps back from the primary podium, temporarily reassigned to strategic planning under review rather than operational enforcement. His posture had changed. Less commanding, more reflective. Ava descended the staircase slowly, heels steady against marble. Conversations softened slightly as she crossed the floor, not from intimidation, but from recognition. She stopped near the center of the lobby, the etched company logo rising behind her in brushed steel. "Gather for a moment," she said evenly. Her voice did not need amplification. It carried. Employees nearby paused and formed a loose semicircle around her. Others watched from the elevators and front desk. The space quieted naturally. Ava looked at each face before she spoke again. 2 weeks ago, she began. This lobby reflected assumption. No accusation. No drama. Just truth. Today it reflects alignment. She allowed the contrast to settle without elaboration. "The final audit confirms compliance," she continued. "Oversight is permanent. Discretion without documentation has been eliminated." She glanced briefly toward Thomas, then back to the group. "Accountability is not punishment. It is precision." The phrase lingered. Several employees nodded subtly. Maya Collins stood near the front of the group, absorbing every word. Ava stepped slightly forward. "No one entering this building should feel measured by appearance," she said evenly. "They should be measured by policy. Policy does not see race. Policy does not see status. Policy sees credential." She paused briefly. "And respect is not credential-based." Silence followed. Not heavy. Grounded. Ava's phone vibrated softly in her pocket. She ignored it for the moment. This space required full attention. "I was asked to wait outside," she said calmly, not as a complaint but as a reminder. Not because the system failed. Because people interpreted it. She lifted her gaze deliberately across the room. The system now leaves no room for interpretation. A faint shift moved through the semicircle. It was not discomfort. It was recognition of closure. Thomas stepped forward slightly, unprompted. "I would like to say something," he said, voice steady but quieter than before. Ava inclined her head, granting the floor without ceremony. Thomas faced the group. "I allowed assumption to move faster than verification," he said. "I did not examine disparity closely enough. That was my failure. No excuses. No deflection." The room absorbed his words quietly. Ava watched him without interruption. After a brief pause, she spoke again. "Leadership is not about never failing," she said. "It is about correcting failure publicly when necessary." She turned slightly toward Thomas. "Your reassignment remains under evaluation. Reflection will determine permanence." It was measured, clear, conditional. Thomas nodded once. The semicircle held steady. Ava then reached into her pocket and removed her phone, glancing briefly at the notification that had arrived moments earlier. Investor confidence rating upgraded following transparency disclosure. She slid the device back into her pocket without comment. Correction had not harmed growth. It had strengthened it. She faced the group once more. "We build structures that outlast us," she said evenly. "Steel, glass, policy, culture." Her voice remained calm, deliberate. "If any of those are flawed, we rebuild them." She let that stand without embellishment. A subtle breath moved collectively through the group. Maya felt it, like a shift in gravity. Ava stepped back slightly, signaling the gathering was complete. "Return to your roles," she said simply. The employees dispersed slowly, conversations resuming in lower tones, but different than before. Not speculative, grounded. Ava remained in the center of the lobby for a moment longer, watching the rhythm resume. Badge. Green light. Entry. Consistent. She turned and walked toward the revolving doors once more, pausing just inside the threshold as she had done on previous days. The winter air beyond had softened further, now hovering near 50 degrees. The city moved in its usual cadence. Taxis. Footsteps. Distant sirens. She stepped outside briefly, looking up at the 38 stories rising above her. The name Monroe etched near the entrance reflected in the afternoon light. She did not see a monument. She saw responsibility. The incident that had begun at this doorway had not required confrontation. It had required recalibration. She remembered her grandfather standing beside his storefront decades earlier, deed in hand, unshaken by doubt. Never argue your value. Demonstrate it. Ava had demonstrated it not through volume, but through structure. Not through humiliation, but through oversight. She re-entered the building once more, the revolving doors parting without friction. Inside, the marble floor reflected steady light. The badge scanners continued their quiet sequence. Green, green, green. She walked toward the elevator bank, the doors opening seamlessly as always. As the cabin ascended toward her office, she caught her reflection in the mirrored wall. Calm, centered, unapologetic. The building had not changed its height. It had changed its standard. And standards, once elevated and reinforced through structure, did not lower easily. When the doors opened on the 38th floor, she stepped out with the same measured pace she had carried since that first afternoon. Ownership did not shout. It aligned. An alignment, once embedded in steel and glass, echoed far beyond a single instruction to wait outside. 1 month after the oversight reforms were embedded into Monroe Tower's operational structure, the lobby no longer felt like a space under scrutiny. It felt like a space operating with intention. The marble floors reflected steady light each morning. The revolving doors rotated without hesitation. Badge scanners continued their quiet rhythm. Green, green, green. The external audit firm had completed its final verification cycle, and the Oversight Committee had transitioned from active correction to sustained monitoring. What had begun as a moment of dismissal had evolved into institutional redesign. Ava Monroe stood in her 38th floor office reviewing the first monthly compliance report generated under the new system. Metrics were steady. Escalation rates balanced. 0 undocumented discretionary verifications. She read each page without rushing, then closed the document and placed it neatly on her desk. Consistency mattered more than praise. Her chief of staff entered with a measured knock. The oversight dashboard is now visible to all regional directors, she said. Ava nodded once. Transparency prevents drift, she replied evenly. Outside the glass walls of her office, Manhattan moved in late afternoon rhythm, sunlight reflecting off neighboring towers. She stepped toward the window briefly, then turned back toward the door. Schedule a regional leadership call, she said calmly. This standard extends beyond this building. Within the hour, directors from Chicago, Dallas, Atlanta, and Los Angeles appeared on the conference screen. Ava addressed them without preamble. Oversight is now a permanent function, she said. Verification must be neutral. Escalation must be documented. There will be no discretionary enforcement without written cause. Her tone remained measured. No dramatics. No reminders of the origin incident. Only policy. One regional director nodded firmly. We have already mirrored the changes, he said. Ava inclined her head slightly. Good, she replied. Alignment is not optional. When the call ended, she descended to the lobby once more. She had made a habit of walking through the space daily, not because she expected failure, but because leadership remained visible. The front desk attendant greeted a visitor smoothly. The security associate scanned badges with neutral efficiency. 3 seconds. Green light. Entry. Maya Collins now stood near the front desk as part of her new rotational assignment within compliance, observing interactions with trained awareness. She noticed Ava approaching and offered a respectful nod. Ava returned it. Observations. Ava asked quietly. Maya responded evenly. No deviations. Consistent application. Ava allowed the faintest hint of approval to register in her expression. Good, she said. She turned slightly and scanned the lobby again, her gaze not searching for mistakes, but for rhythm. Rhythm signaled alignment. At the far end of the space, Thomas Whitaker approached carefully. His reassignment had lasted 4 weeks. He had submitted detailed corrective proposals and completed independent certification under the new standards. He stopped at a respectful distance. The strategic compliance draft is complete, he said. Calmly, Ava studied him for a moment. There was no defiance in his posture now, only attentiveness. Send it to the Oversight Committee, she replied. If alignment is confirmed, your evaluation will conclude. Thomas nodded once. Understood. She did not extend further comment. Accountability had moved beyond apology. It had become measurable. Ava walked toward the revolving doors and paused just inside the threshold as she had done many times since that first afternoon. The winter had softened into early spring. The air outside carried less bite. Pedestrians moved briskly along the sidewalk, unaware of the structural shift that had unfolded behind the glass. She remembered that first moment clearly. The calm voice instructing her to step outside. The assumption delivered without hostility, yet heavy with implication. She had not responded with outrage. She had responded with architecture. Behind her now, the lobby operated without hesitation. The same doors that had once framed exclusion now framed neutrality. She stepped outside briefly, looking up at the 38 stories rising above her. The name Monroe remained etched in steel. Ownership had never been in question. Recognition had. And recognition had been recalibrated through policy rather than pride. Her phone vibrated softly. A notification confirmed that Monroe Global Holdings had been shortlisted for a National Leadership Ethics Award based on recent transparency initiatives. Ava read the message once, then slipped the phone back into her pocket. Awards were secondary. Structure was primary. She re-entered the building and walked toward the elevator bank. As the doors opened smoothly, she caught her reflection in the mirrored panel once more. Calm, centered, certain. The building no longer required correction in that space. It required continuity. When she reached the 38th floor, she returned to her desk and reviewed the compliance draft Thomas had submitted. Line by line, she read his proposed safeguards. Mandatory dual review of escalations. Real-time oversight alerts. Quarterly demographic analysis published internally. She finished reading and sent a single response. Approved pending committee confirmation. Her decision was not emotional. It was evaluative. Later that afternoon, she gathered the Oversight Committee once more in the glass suite overlooking the lobby. Sustainability requires ownership at every level, she said evenly. We do not centralize accountability. We distribute it. Maya listened closely, recognizing that the shift had moved from reaction to reinforcement. When the session concluded, Ava remained behind briefly, watching the steady flow of employees below. The marble floor reflected even light. The badge scanners continued their quiet cadence. Green, green, green. She allowed herself a slow breath. The incident that had begun at the threshold of this building had transformed into institutional clarity. No one entering now would be measured against perception. They would be measured against policy, and policy would be measured against oversight. Ava turned away from the glass railing and walked toward the elevator, posture steady as ever. Leadership had not required volume. It had required recalibration. And recalibration, once embedded, did not fade with time. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Monroe Tower continued its rhythm below. Steel, glass, policy, culture, aligned. 3 months after the oversight reforms were embedded into Monroe Tower's operational structure, the shift was no longer visible only in data. It was visible in posture, in pace, in tone. The marble lobby that once carried a quiet undercurrent of assumption now carried equilibrium. Badge. Green light. Entry. No pause. No added scrutiny. The oversight dashboard, mounted discreetly within compliance, reflected steady metrics across 90 consecutive days. 0 undocumented escalations. Balanced demographic verification. Response times consistent to the second. The building did not celebrate the numbers. It lived them. Ava Monroe stood once again on the mezzanine level overlooking the lobby floor, hands resting lightly on the glass railing, observing not for failure, but for rhythm. Culture, when corrected at the root, became quiet. That quiet was the evidence. Her chief of staff joined her with a slim folder. The Oversight Committee has completed its quarterly review, she said. Ava accepted the folder and scanned the summary. Recommendations affirmed. Structural safeguards sustained. Cross-review functioning as designed. She closed the folder gently. Distribute this company-wide, she replied evenly. Visibility sustains trust. Downstairs, Maya Collins guided a new hire through lobby protocol training. She explained the difference between verification and discretion, between policy and perception. The new hire listened carefully, nodding as Maya demonstrated the badge scanner and escalation dashboard. 3 seconds, Maya said calmly. Consistency protects everyone. Ava watched the interaction from above, recognizing that the shift had moved beyond compliance into culture. It had become language. It had become habit. At mid-morning, the Oversight Committee convened in the glass conference suite for its first quarterly recognition review. Thomas Whitaker sat at the table with a revised posture. His strategic compliance framework had been implemented across regional offices. Escalation transparency was now automated. Ava took her seat at the head of the table without notes. Today is not about correction, she began evenly. It is about continuity. The committee members nodded. The dashboard displayed 90 days of alignment. A compliance officer spoke first. We have sustained 0 discretionary deviations, she reported. Regional audits reflect identical metrics. Ava inclined her head once. Consistency is the objective, she said. She then turned her gaze toward Thomas. Your evaluation period concludes today. The room remained still. Thomas met her eyes directly. Thank you for the opportunity to correct, he said quietly. Ava held his gaze for a measured second. Leadership requires reflection, she replied. You have demonstrated structural alignment. Your operational authority will be reinstated under continued oversight. There was no applause, no visible relief, only acknowledgement. Thomas nodded once, absorbing both reinstatement and responsibility. Ava shifted her focus back to the group. Oversight remains permanent, she added. Authority does not return to autonomy. It remains accountable. The message was clear. Reintegration did not erase structure. It operated within it. After the committee adjourned, Ava descended to the lobby once more. The revolving doors turned smoothly as a group of visitors entered, pausing briefly at the threshold before scanning their badges. Green light. Entry. No hesitation. Ava stepped toward the front desk and observed without speaking. The attendant greeted each visitor evenly. The security associate maintained posture without presumption. Maya glanced up and met Ava's eyes with quiet confidence. Ava nodded once in return. Outside, early spring sunlight reflected brightly against the tower's glass facade. The air had warmed to 60 degrees, carrying a different softness than the winter day when she had first been asked to wait outside. She stepped toward the doors and paused again just inside the threshold, remembering that moment not as a wound but as a catalyst. She had not demanded apology. She had redesigned expectation. The city moved beyond the glass in steady cadence. Taxis, pedestrians, distant conversation. She stepped outside briefly and looked up at the 38 stories above her. The name Monroe gleamed clearly in the sunlight. Ownership had never required announcement. It required alignment. She turned and re-entered the lobby, walking with the same measured pace she had carried since that first afternoon. Employees continued their rhythm uninterrupted. Badge. Green light. Entry. Policy had replaced perception. Oversight had replaced assumption. Later that afternoon, Ava gathered staff informally in the lobby without platform or microphone. She stood at ground level among them. 3 months ago, she said evenly, this space taught us something. She paused briefly. It taught us that culture must be designed intentionally. Her gaze moved across the group, steady and calm. We did not respond with volume. We responded with structure. She allowed the phrase to settle. That is how this company operates. No one applauded. They understood. Recognition did not require spectacle. It required continuity. Ava stepped back and allowed the group to disperse naturally. She remained for a moment longer, watching the badge scanners continue their quiet sequence. Green, green, green. The lobby no longer reflected tension. It reflected trust. She turned and walked toward the elevator bank once more. As the doors opened, she caught her reflection in the mirrored panel. Calm, certain, unmoved. The instruction to wait outside had not diminished her authority. It had clarified her responsibility. And responsibility, when exercised deliberately, reshaped institutions without raising a voice. As the elevator ascended toward her office, Monroe Tower continued its steady rhythm below. Steel, glass, policy, culture, sustained. 6 months after the oversight reforms became permanent, Monroe Tower no longer carried even a memory of imbalance in its daily rhythm. The marble lobby reflected late spring sunlight in clean, even lines. The revolving doors turned with quiet consistency. Badge. Green light. Entry. The cadence had become instinctive. What once required correction now required only maintenance. Ava Monroe stood at the center of the lobby early that morning before most employees had arrived. The building hummed softly around her, elevators rising and descending with muted precision. She did not stand there as a symbol of authority. She stood there as a steward of alignment. The oversight dashboard had just completed its second quarterly cycle. 0 discretionary deviations. Full regional compliance. External verification confirmed sustained equity in access enforcement. Data had matured into culture. Her chief of staff approached with a tablet displaying the latest internal engagement survey results. Employee trust metrics had risen 12% since the reforms. Perceived fairness and operational procedure had increased 18%. Ava reviewed the numbers quietly. Growth in culture was rarely as visible as growth in revenue, yet it mattered more. She handed the tablet back without comment. Prepare a company-wide address, she said calmly. Ground level. By mid-morning, employees gathered informally in the lobby and tuned in from regional offices across the country. No stage had been erected. No elevated platform separated leadership from staff. Ava stood at floor level among them, the steel company logo visible behind her. She allowed the room to quiet naturally before speaking. 6 months ago, she began evenly. This building reflected a gap between policy and practice. No accusation colored her voice. Only acknowledgement. We corrected that gap. She paused briefly, letting the words settle. Not with outrage. Not with spectacle. With structure. The employees listened without shifting. They remembered. Some had been present that first afternoon. Others had joined after, drawn by the company's response rather than deterred by its flaw. Ava continued. Respect is not situational. It is structural. If it depends on recognition, it is unstable. If it depends on policy, it endures. The sentence echoed softly against the marble. She glanced toward Maya Collins, now permanently assigned to compliance strategy after her rotational appointment proved her capacity. Maya stood taller, her expression steady. Thomas Whitaker stood among senior staff, posture grounded. His reinstatement months earlier had not restored old patterns. It had embedded oversight into his approach. Ava shifted her gaze across the semicircle of employees. Leadership does not prove power by raising its voice, she said calmly. It proves power by raising its standard. She let that linger. No applause followed. None was necessary. She stepped back slightly, signaling the gathering would remain informal. Questions emerged naturally. One employee asked, "What ensures this alignment continues when leadership changes?" Ava met the question directly. "Oversight is institutional," she replied. "It does not retire. It does not transfer. It remains." Another asked, "What did you feel that first day?" The lobby quieted slightly at the vulnerability of the question. Ava held the silence for a moment before answering. "I felt clarity," she said. Clarity that structure required refinement. No bitterness entered her tone. No personal grievance surfaced. Only responsibility. The questions subsided gradually, and the employees dispersed back to their roles. The lobby resumed its steady cadence. Badge. Green light. Entry. Ava remained standing for a moment longer, absorbing the atmosphere not as a chief executive, but as a designer of systems. The instruction to wait outside had long since transformed into something else. It had become a hinge. A pivot point. She walked toward the revolving doors and paused once more just inside the threshold. The air outside carried warmth now, the temperature near 70 degrees. Summer approached. The city moved briskly, unaware of the shift that had taken place behind the glass months earlier. She stepped outside briefly and looked up at the 38 stories rising above her. The name Monroe gleamed against the blue sky. Ownership had never been uncertain. Recognition had. And recognition had been rebuilt through architecture, not argument. She remembered her grandfather's voice as clearly as ever. Never argue your value. Demonstrate it. She had demonstrated it not through retaliation, but through reform. Not through punishment, but through precision. She re-entered the lobby, the doors rotating smoothly behind her. Inside, the marble floor reflected light evenly. The badge scanners continued their quiet rhythm. Green, green, green. No hesitation. No added scrutiny. Just policy applied without bias. Ava walked slowly toward the elevator bank, employees nodding respectfully as she passed. Not deferential. Aligned. The elevator doors opened seamlessly. As she stepped inside, she caught her reflection once more in the mirrored wall. Calm. Centered. Resolved. The building had not changed its height. It had changed its culture. And culture, once corrected at the root, outlived the moment that sparked it. When the elevator doors closed and began their ascent, the lobby below remained steady. Steel. Glass. Policy. Oversight. Respect. Integrated. Ava did not need a camera to document what had happened. She did not need applause to validate it. The proof existed in 3 seconds at a time. Badge. Green light. Entry. She had not been diminished by being told to stand outside. She had redesigned the inside. And in doing so, she had ensured that no one else would have to measure their belonging against perception again. Leadership, she knew, was not about occupying space. It was about shaping it. And she had shaped this one without ever raising her voice.